So I've been thinking I should probably make a video where I talk about like what my main views are, like kind of like condensing it into almost like my own constitution or whatever you want to call it, like my own, like essentially a list of the tenets of my beliefs. Like what are the main things I believe in that are the most important, that I think, that I would, things that I would like to see the right as a whole embrace, and that I think are non-negotiable, because I think there's a lot of things that are negotiable that are just minor issues that there can be differences on. But I think these things are things that I see as like, I really wish that everyone could just get behind these principles. And I'm not trying to say these beliefs are unique to me. Like, I think there's a lot of people who are like kind of like socially right wing, but like economically more socialist leaning, who have similar beliefs to me. I'm not even saying like radically socialist. I'm just saying people who, again, there can be differences on that too. Like some are more radically socialist, some might be more just simply a bit economically left of center. So anyway, I think these are 20. I have 20 points here that are basically, I think, the fundamentals of what I believe in. So I'm just going to list them out one by one. The first is a commitment to racial slash ethno nationalism and the preservation of different races, ethnicities, and cultures. So what this means is basically a recognition that genetics is linked to culture, and that you can't really have one without the other, and that different human subgroups deserve to be preserved in the same way as like animals do. Now, obviously, there's a certain idealism to this, and realistically, one group being preserved is often at the expense of another. I think it's possible for all ethnic groups in the world to be preserved to some extent, but I will admit there's definitely a lot of room for disagreement, a lot of inherent contentiousness over like which group gets preserved to what extent, like who gets what land and things like that. So I do admit that's obviously, again, that's something where there can be room for disagreement over, which ethnic group or which race is entitled to like what specific piece of land or what have you. But I do think it's a good principle to have, like the basic principle that like all groups to some extent should have a right to preserve themselves, and it's a good thing to preserve the diversity of humanity, like the different races and ethnic groups and cultures that exist. And obviously we can get into debates over what constitutes a legitimate ethnic group, like especially like in Europe, where you have like are Lombards an ethnic group, or what about like the different subgroups within Lombards? Like I know in Europe you have languages down to like the village level in some cases, like languages that used to exist or in some cases maybe still exist. But yeah, obviously there's splitting hairs over like what constitutes a specific ethnic group or race. But I think in other cases, like you'd have to be ridiculous to say they don't exist. Like to say, for instance, there's no such thing as French people, or there's no such thing as Germans, or there's no such thing as Italians. It's like you'd have to be like lying. You'd have to be speaking in bad faith to be making such statements, because they're so just blatantly false and blatantly disprovable and just malicious and in bad faith. But yeah, like fair enough. Like there's disagreements over the specifics, but I think by and large, it's a support for the idea of racial and ethnic and cultural preservation of different groups. The second is gender realism, like an acknowledgement of the fact that men and women are different, and that yes, as individuals we're different too, but at the same time there are certain commonalities among men and among women, and I think there has to be a recognition of this rather than treating us as interchangeable. So I would say, again, just as like my first point goes hand in hand with rejecting the idea of globalism and multiculturalism and just mixing the entire world together, this second point goes against the idea of like the idea that like, oh, men and women are the same, gender doesn't matter or whatever. But it also rejects the radical feminist, like, because there are plenty of feminists who believe, oh yes, gender exists, men and women are different, but men are awful and horrible and women are amazing and perfect. Like, there's a lot of feminists today who believe that. Like, I think the idea that gender differences don't matter was kind of a bit more of a 1990s or 2000s thing, and nowadays it's more that gender differences do matter, but women are better than men. And there's also transgenderism, which, okay, I'm getting into in my next few points. But yeah, I think we have to reject this, and I think we need a society where it's acknowledged that men and women are different. And yes, in practice, this will lead to a society where men occupy the majority of leadership positions, because I do think men just have more of a natural inclination toward pursuing leadership positions. That being said, I'm not saying there should be no female leaders, and there have been in history. Like, there have been queens, we was queens, in different societies across the globe. It's just that male leadership has generally been the norm. But there have always been some female leaders here and there. And again, there always will be those exceptional women, and I don't see why they shouldn't be allowed to be themselves if that's who they really are. If they do really have those leadership inclinations, I don't think they should be held back by being a woman. I don't think they should be denied it because they're a woman, but I think it's realistic to acknowledge that, like, oh, this so-called glass ceiling, like, I don't think we're ever going to have a society with 50-50 gender parity, because I just think men more often have that tendency, that natural inclination toward leadership. It might be like 80-20, it might be like 90-10, it might be like 75-25, or even 70-30, but I don't think it's ever going to be 50-50. And it sure as hell shouldn't be matriarchy. Because that, to me, it's just, I don't know, that just seems unnatural. Like, it just seems to go against nature in a fundamental way. And I'm not saying we should be slaves to nature, but I'm just saying that, like, men just generally tend to have that inclination more than women do. And I've observed it personally. Like, a lot of women don't want to become CEOs. They don't like the level of responsibility. They don't like the level of, like, workaholism required to be a CEO or to be like an upper level executive. And that's partly why I think middle management tends to be dominated by women, whereas upper management doesn't. Because for women, I think there is a ceiling, but it's not a glass ceiling. It's often a self-imposed ceiling where it's like they don't want to be workaholics past a certain point. There's a certain point where they're like, okay, this is too much. And to be honest, I completely sympathize. I don't want to be a fucking CEO either. In fact, I don't even want to be a middle manager. I'd say I'm less of a workaholic than many women. But, like, nonetheless, in general, yeah, I do think more men have that inclination, and I think that's something that we can't really, nor should we be trying to change. And on the other side of the coin, men also tend to dominate dangerous jobs, like really dangerous, like construction or trades, or just stuff that's like really physically demanding, takes a harsh toll on your body, like lumber workers, fisher people. You can't say fishermen because, yeah, there's some women too, but yeah. Men tend to dominate those jobs also. So it's sort of like there's the glass ceiling, but then there's also the glass floor. Now, I mean, calling it a glass floor, it's like, yeah, okay, fair enough. Some of those jobs are high paying, but they're dangerous. They're shitty. There's a reason why a lot of people don't want to work those jobs. And that's another thing. I think men are more risk taking, like, in general. Like, you can even see it in statistics at national parks. People who die at national parks are overwhelmingly men, and it's because men engage in riskier behavior. Like, they'll go to the edge of a cliff or something like that. And yeah, there's just certain psychological differences between men and women that I think need to be recognized and understood, which means rejecting both gender blindness, but like the idea men and women are the same, but also rejecting radical feminism, which seeks to basically put women in roles that are mostly occupied by men. Okay, so my third stance is support of heteronormativity. Basically, an acknowledgement that heterosexuality is the norm and that that's how it's been for all of history. And again, like some people are gay and that's who they are, but at the same time, it shouldn't be. There's nothing wrong with treating heterosexuality as the norm because it is. Like most people are heterosexual and always have been. And I think lately there's just been too much pushing of LGBT ideology to the point where it's like they're trying to get people to question their heterosexuality, even if these people actually are heterosexual. And they're not doing the reverse. They're not telling gay people, oh, you know what? You might actually be a little bit bisexual. I never see them doing that. I never see them doing that. But they're always trying to push like, oh, are you sure you're totally straight? Like it's such a double standard and it's such an obvious agenda to push LGBTism as the norm. And again, like I do think there's certain people who are like legitimately like gay or bisexual or what have you, but I think pushing it as the norm, like, is it really helping people? Because it's like when you look at like the high rates of like sexually transmitted diseases, like that's a major issue, at least within like the male gay community. And it's like, should we be pushing this lifestyle on more men, even men who aren't really interested in it, but just pushing them in that direction? I don't know. I don't personally think we should be. I mean, I think we can let gay people be gay to some extent. I mean, what I mean is like let them be gay, but like they're still accountable to the law. And that's another thing. Like there's a lot of double standards these days where gays get away with things that straight people can't get away with. And they probably shouldn't be getting away with these things. Like in some cases, they're getting away with things that are flat out illegal or at least morally questionable, like in terms of like age gaps. And it's like there's this huge double standard now where even the smallest age gaps in heterosexual relationships come under massive scrutiny. But in gay relationships, especially among men, but also I've noticed among lesbian relationships too, are not subject to the same level of scrutiny. Like, look at this movie, Call Me By Your Name. Like, I think, what is it, like some like 18-year-old guy and like a 29-year-old guy or 17-year-old guy and a 29-year-old guy, something like that. And it's like, I'm sorry, but that movie only came out like a few years ago. It was well into the post-woke era, into the woke era, not the post, there's no post-woke era. But yeah, and people embraced it. It was nominated for Best Picture. It's like, I'm sorry, but a movie with a heterosexual relationship where the man is 29 and the woman is 17 or whatever the fuck it was in that movie, that would fall under a lot of scrutiny and criticism. But yet there's this double standard. And there's a double standard even for heterosexual relationships where the woman's older, like in that movie Licorice Pizza, which I think also got nominated for Best Picture. So yeah, I mean, my point is there is this today. There's become this double standard where it's like LGBTs, in some ways, are allowed to get away with things that heterosexuals aren't allowed to get away with, and it's become this like this effort to not only normalize LGBT sexualities but privilege them above heterosexuals, and that is something like, again, I think. I'm against that. I'm staunchly against that. I support heteronormativity. I support the idea that heterosexuality is the norm and that LGBT lifestyles should not be pushed on people. In line with that is support for the traditional family, like support for the idea that like kids should have two-parent households. Like that's the healthiest environment to grow up in. Have a mother and a father, not just a single parent. Statistics back that up. Like people who grow up in two-parent households generally have the best outcomes. And yeah, two-parent households where there's a mother and a father. So yeah, that support for the traditional family. That's the next one. The next is the acknowledgement of disproportionate Jewish power. And this is something we can't get around. This is a big issue and it has to be addressed, is that in Western societies today, Jewish people have an extremely disproportionate amount of power and have wielded this power in a very nepotistic way to support their own goals, their own interests at the expense of others, primarily at the expense of the white majority, increasingly not the majority, but also at the expenses of other groups as well. And I think a central tenet has to be recognizing this fact and not brushing it under the rug. Recognizing it, talking about it, and finding, like talking about, like, I hesitate to use the word solution in this context because that has certain connotations that I'm not trying to go for, but trying to find ways to address this issue. And the fucking JIDF, like they lie and lie and lie. They claim there is no Jewish overrepresentation. It's like, yes, there is. In Ivy League schools, in the super rich, in just people with power, in politics, media, academia. Just stop fucking lying. Stop saying there's no overrepresentation. Stop saying there's no nepotism here. There is. And stop saying that there's no ethnic promotion of in-group interests. There is. Okay? And there's such hypocrisy over it too, because they rub it in our faces. Oh, we're so much smarter than you. Our average verbal IQ is so much higher. We're so much more educated. We're so much smarter. They rub it in our faces on one hand, but then on the other hand, they claim, oh, but there is no overrepresentation in elite or high earning or powerful circles. It's like, shut up. You're lying. You're full of shit. And you know it. And frankly, there is one thing they're right about, though, which is that the average goy is fucking stupid. I agree with them on that. The average goy is stupid. But what this means is that, frankly, the goyim need to get smarter. That's what it really means. The goyim need to get smarter and need to understand the situation. So, okay, the next one is... And again, by the way, I'm not trying to say that there's no other groups that have nepotism, that engage in nepotism, or that have disproportionate power. There's plenty of groups that do. But the Jews just do it at a far higher level than anyone else. Like, the disproportionate levels of power among them is just so astronomically higher than any other group. Like, maybe the second highest, at least in Canada, might be Sikhs. But it's not even close. It's not even in the same ballpark. And again, in the United States, the second highest might be Mormons, but it's not even close. It's not even in the same ballpark. So, yeah. The next on this list is support for local businesses. So this means like rejecting the McDonaldization of the planet, rejecting just mega chains everywhere, and supporting local businesses instead. Because local businesses add to culture, especially restaurants, bars, businesses of that nature, grocery stores. They add to the sense of local culture. They make places feel more unique. And yeah, I mean, this is part of the broader issue of cultural preservation, which I'm going to talk about more here. But yeah. Now the next one is support for traditional art and architecture, which goes hand in hand with this in terms of cultural preservation, acknowledging that our architecture is an important part of the identity of different communities. You know, it's what makes France look French or Italy look Italian is the architecture, and you can't really have cultural preservation without architectural preservation. Like places where the architecture isn't very well preserved tend to just lose their culture at a much faster rate, which we see is happening in the United States, Canada, Germany, like countries that are, have suffered worse losses of architecture in the 20th century are also becoming assimilated into this like globalist bugman capitalist culture at a faster rate than other cultures. So, and also just architectural and artistic beauty in and of itself has value. as something that humans aspire toward, to represent their cultures, to represent human creativity, to create an environment of beauty where culture and community can flourish. So absolutely, this support for traditional art and architecture, also for the continued evolution of these styles. Also, like again, we can create new styles, but they should be new styles that build upon the principles of traditional art and architecture, rather than simply flushing them down the toilet, the urinal drinking fountain, as modernism very much did. So the next on the list is, which goes hand in hand with it, is support for traditional urban planning. So that means walkable communities, the heavy use of public transit, not basing everything around cars, not making everything suburban sprawl. There can be some differences in density levels, like maybe some places should be more like New York City or Paris, which are really dense. And then you can have other places that are not quite as dense, but still walkable, like places like Charleston, South Carolina, for instance. There can be different degrees of it to an extent, but I don't think suburban sprawl should really, frankly, exist at all. Or if it does exist, it should only exist on a very small level. Like, I think how it is in Europe is like it doesn't exist as much, frankly, because people can't afford it because it's taxed at the level it should be. And yeah, I mean, it destroys culture, it destroys community, it creates a place that is a non-place. And I think there has to be a rejection of it and a support for traditional urban planning. So places that are walkable, places that are transit oriented, and that are not car oriented sprawl. And again, rural areas can be rural. But even within rural areas, like in Europe, you see walkable villages and towns, for instance. So even there, like, you don't have the sprawl everywhere, even in rural areas to the same extent. But yeah, I mean, you have farms, you have farmhouses. And yes, there are some people who do need to drive to get around, even in Europe, like farmers. But at the same time, it is more transit oriented, which is a good thing. Although, sadly, in recent years, since 2020, Europe has been starting to slowly go down, maybe not slowly, like starting to go down the path of car centrism a bit more, which is worrying. But yeah, support for traditional urban planning. The next thing on the list is support for workers' rights. So this means a society where workers are not treated like shit, where your safety is respected. You're not expected to do all this unsafe work. Like, basic safety precautions are taken into account, where you're treated like a human being, where you're not being overworked, where you have reasonable vacation time, holiday time off. At the same time, though, like, I will concede some European countries might go a bit too far. Like, I've heard there's some countries that have like 30 federal holidays a year on top of vacation time or something. I don't know if it's that much, but it's like, okay, like maybe there's a bit of a median here, but I would say at very least 4 weeks vacation should be the norm. And I would say people shouldn't be working in excess of like 40 to 45 hours a week, generally speaking. Now, people should work when they're in the office. Like, for instance, in Greece, the issue in Greece is that people actually work really long hours, but they slack off half the time. And it's like, that shouldn't be the norm either. But at the same time, workaholism is fucking toxic, and it ruins people, and it creates a society of people who are just so overworked that they have no energy left for anything but work, which is why they become obese. It's why you see such high obesity rates in countries like the United States, because of workaholism largely. Like, being healthy takes time and energy, which is something that they don't have left over at the end of the day. So I think, yeah, support for workers' rights is crucial. Again, I'm not supporting communism. I'm not supporting literal, unironic communism. I'm supporting essentially a market economy with some degree of control. And in terms of workers' rights, and in terms of also like things like not being able to put literal poison in our food, like laws governing food safety and things of that nature. So and not legalizing like fucking heroin and shit like that, like some basic regard for public health and public safety. So yeah, workers' rights and control of corporations, but still preventing, and also preventing, like again, like what I mentioned with like fast food megacorps, like preventing certain predatory monopolies from forming where certain companies just become way too big. But at the same time, I'm not talking about a totally command economy. I'm talking like about a market economy with restrictions, essentially. All right, so the next thing I have on the list is linguistic preservation. So I think, yeah, like this is part of cultural preservation also. It's the preservation of language and dialects, also like accents. And this is especially important for basically any language that isn't English, but I would say especially like languages that are more threatened, like smaller languages that don't have as many speakers, like say the Basque language, for instance, or French in Quebec. Like French has plenty of speakers worldwide, but the French in Quebec are kind of a bit of a linguistic island. So cases like that, like linguistic preservation, because I think that is also an important part of cultural preservation as a whole. Okay, so the next thing I have, okay, so support for public transit, I kind of covered that already. Recognition of man-made climate change. Now this is one thing that might be a deal breaker for some people, but I think it's important, and I think we can't ignore it. That man-made climate change is real, that it's probably the single biggest threat that we face as a species, as a planet right now. It's real, it's observable, it is happening in front of our very eyes. The weather is getting warmer. Certain natural disasters have increased as a result of the weather getting normal, and this can have very, very disastrous effects in the long term. So recognition of the fact that man-made climate change exists and that we need to address it in some way, shape, or form. Now, some of the things I've mentioned would already address it, like moving toward more walkable communities and public transit. But I acknowledge that that there's other things that may need to be done also, like shift toward greener energy, for instance, in power plants, in transportation, like electric cars. Although electric cars come with their own issues, I kind of prefer public transit as a solution. But again, some people still need to drive in certain cases. So, I mean, maybe electric cars are better in those cases. In terms of like airplanes and ships, I don't know to what extent we can improve the cleanliness or greenness of that technology. But if it's possible, it's something we need to be investing in. So, yeah. The next thing that goes hand in hand with that is recognition of global overpopulation. And I think, again, like I'm not saying every country in the world is overpopulated, but I'm saying the world as a whole is overpopulated. It's contributing to climate change, but it's also contributing to other problems, overcrowding in certain parts of the world, over tourism, depletion of natural resources, which is something that goes hand in hand as an environmental consequence. Because again, there's certain natural resources we need and that are non-renewable. Like even if we're not using oil for gasoline or for power plants, we still need it for certain forms of manufacturing. So yeah, I mean, recognition of global overpopulation, but at the same time, a recognition of the fact that like not everywhere in the world is overpopulated, and some parts of the world, frankly, need to do more to rein in their population growth than others. And again, overpopulation is not just from birth rate, it's also from immigration. Like what Canada is doing right now is also irresponsible, increasing its population at a rate that I believe exceeds the average global population growth rate. And it's entirely because of immigration. And that is irresponsible also. So yeah, recognition of global overpopulation. Like right now with the current technology we have, I don't think we can sustain ourselves at current population levels, never mind the projections for how much we're expected to grow before the year 2100, when presumably it'll level off. And I don't know, maybe it'll level off sooner than that, but we don't know. But yeah, with current technology, the world is overpopulated, but I question, even with any level of tech, Can we sustain the current population? I don't think so, because certain resources are inherently non-renewable. Land is inherently non-renewable. Can't just build more land. I mean, we sort of can with man-made islands, but I don't think those are easy to create. So yeah, I mean, agriculture. Agriculture requires land. It's not just living space for people. It's also agriculture. And over tourism, again, you can't just build another Venice. I mean, you could, but it would be fake and just cheesy. And it's like, just wouldn't be the same. Like just building a new Venice in like a different part of the world, like in like what they do in China with like these fake replicas that don't even look that good. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why overpopulation is an issue. The next is preservation of natural beauty. So this means in addition to preserving, the environment as a whole through combating climate change, through combating other forms of environmental destruction, there's also the recognition that certain places need to be preserved because they're especially naturally beautiful. Like this is basically the idea behind national parks. And this is why, again, like I support the continuation of this system, or in some cases, the expansion of the national parks and other official wilderness areas like state parks, provincial parks, what have you. The preservation of natural beauty. And again, there needs to be some sort of balance between preservation and access, which is an issue that the national parks have faced a lot lately, like the question of how do you guarantee public access while also preserving these places. And it can be a tricky balance to strike, but a recognition of, the need to preserve natural beauty. The next is a commitment to public healthcare and education. Now, I think there's varying levels of like the public-private spectrum. I don't think there needs to be like one definitive answer as to what the right balance is. But let me put it this way. I think the American system where people pay ridiculous fees for healthcare and education, like higher education, that system is just not workable. It's a system that fucks over anyone who's even remotely poor, even like lower middle class people, even like middle class people. It's a system that only benefits the rich, and I don't support such a system. I don't think it's eugenic either. I don't buy the idea that like it's eugenic to only favor the super rich or like the upper middle class, because I don't think that eugenic traits always correlate entirely with wealth. I think, for instance, like certain negative traits like sociopathy, hyper individualism, hyper selfishness can also correlate with being very wealthy. So yeah, I mean, I think there's reasons to oppose this, to oppose like healthcare or educational systems that totally fuck over anybody who's not super rich. So yeah, a commitment to like a healthcare or education system that is, let me put it this way, that is more public than the current system that exists in the United States. The next, which goes hand in hand with this, is support providing welfare, at least some degree of welfare for poor people who need it. Now, again, I don't think the social assistance shouldn't be unconditional. It should come with a lot of strings attached. And yes, there are some countries that go too far with it. Like there are some countries in Europe that go way too far. Like for instance, when I was I think it was in a museum in Paris somewhere, where I saw that it was actually free for people who are unemployed. And it's like, okay, you're literally incentivizing people to be unemployed by doing that. So I wouldn't go that far. But at the same time, it's like, okay, there should be some welfare for people who need it and for people who have demonstrated that they are trying to get on their feet. Like they're working or they're trying to get a job or something. And there should be certain stipulations that come with it. But yes, we should have some support for poor people within our society who need it. The exact degree of which is, that's something that I think is up for debate. But I think, there should be some support. There should be some level of social assistance for people in need. The next is maintaining a basic level of law and order. again, like I may not be as hardline on this as some people, but I do think like what's happening in places like California where they're just letting people, like they basically legalize shoplifting under $1,000 there. That sort of anarchy should not be tolerated. Like in a civilized society, there needs to be some amount of law and order. And when you have like that level of like petty crime, or in the case of like places like Detroit, levels of homicide that are ridiculously high, like that sort of thing just can't be tolerated in a civilized society. So like maintaining some basic degree of law and order. But at the same time, I think people's civil rights should be respected to the extent that like I do believe in the idea of innocent until proven guilty. I believe in the idea that people should have a fair trial. I also believe in the idea that if people genuinely are trying to do better, that they should have the opportunity to be rehabilitated if they've demonstrated a genuine commitment toward improving themselves, especially over time, and especially if the crimes they committed were when they were a lot younger. But yeah, I believe in forgiveness, but I also believe in basic law and order, and I think it is a possible balance to strike. So yeah, my next tenet would be support for free speech. And this is probably my most libertarian belief, is that I actually do think free speech is necessary, because I think to have an intelligent society, you need some amount of free discourse. Censorship just kind of dumbs people down, I think. Like, I think to have an intelligent discourse, you need to have somewhat of a free flow of ideas. That said, free speech doesn't mean freedom to do whatever you want. Like, say, for instance, when it comes to porn, I think porn should be banned. Like, at least the creation of... I don't think it's ever possible to ban people from watching porn, but it's possible to ban the porn industry from operating in your country. And I think that should be illegal. But at the same time, I don't view porn as free speech. Porn is not speech. It is filming a video of people fucking. That is not speech. Free speech would be if somebody says they believe that porn should be legal. If somebody says they believe porn should be legal and they make an argument for why they think that, that would fall under speech. And that is something where I would disagree with it, but I'd say, yes, that falls under free speech. That should be allowed. So that would be an example of what I view as free speech and what it means. And finally, the last thing on this is something I meant to mention this earlier. In line with some of the other things I mentioned is support for cultural preservation as a whole, which would include things like food, like literature, music, festivals, parades, holidays, like cuisine, I also mentioned art and architecture as its own thing, but yeah, other aspects of culture as well. Even movies and TV could be part of it to an extent. But yeah, like support for cultural preservation. So, and essentially also supporting the local over the global in that regard, like local cuisine, local restaurants, local types of music, festivals, etc. Like things on a local or regional level as opposed to like just generic globalist culture. So I think that's really what I'm kind of talking about here. Like support for culture preservation on a local / regional / national level, as opposed to like generic globalist culture. So like as opposed to like McDonald's, Marvel Cinematic Universe, Disney, etc. So yeah, I guess those would be the main tenets of what I believe in and what I support for society.